I assume give us another minute and then we can start. Thank you.
Yep.
Tomo, we're all set. We can start.
All right. You can see my screen, right? Because I'm not used to Zoom very much, actually.
Um,
Uh,
we go for the
I'll,
introduction first, Sarah.
yeah,
Sorry.
I'll just introduce you and then you can start.
Yep, sure.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Brain Food session. Today we have Sarah Chong with us, and Sarah will be talking about a very interesting subject, communications design and how to keep it simple. Something that all of us can appreciate how important and essential it is. And Sarah is the head of design at MoneySmart, where she has grown from designing infographics and animated content to design strategies, visual design languages, experience design, and developing the design organization at MoneySmart, and also mentoring other designers. This is a brief, that is the brief introduction of Sarah. And before I hand it over to Sarah, just a quick reminder that please turn off your microphone and camera. And throughout the session, please ensure that those are turned off. Also, if you have any questions during the session, please leave them in the chat box. Also, I'll remind you to not take any screenshots or record the session, as this session is being recorded at our end with permission from Sarah, and it will be uploaded later on. Thank you. And Sarah, you can now take over and start.
Yep. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk. I'm not used to presenting to no faces, but anyway, this is interesting. So communication design, right? Keeping it simple. Okay, so pretty much I have an introduction already, right? So basically, one thing I actually learned from my entire time as a designer, from someone who just designs infographics every single day for a whole year, until, pretty much running a design organization in a business. So 90% of my job is actually communicating, because ultimately you can come up with the best ideas, the best visions, the best strategy, the best team culture, but then no one enacts it, no one understands it if you don't know how to communicate it well. And communicating is not just talking at someone or listening to words, it's also trying to get your message across to people. So I spent a lot of time influencing change, negotiating, like creating processes and operations, also empowering and enabling designers, because as we all know, like designers, some researchers I know as well, right? We're all quite introverted people. So learning how to communicate actually empowers us as well, and doing our job even better, and actually really reaching what we want to reach. So yes, and so also I have spent time in the past, before I was working at MoneySmart, I used to teach semesters of figure drawing in school. So I actually have gotten to learn how to teach people who are not designers. I taught engineers how to do figure drawing. So learning to speak in the same language, you can actually pretty much change how people think, change how people create things as well. So first thing about communication design, right? It's that a lot of people assume it's common sense, because you just say what you mean, right? You just be clear about it. Saying that you just have to be clear about it is not enough. And common sense is never common sense, as most of us would have known, as long as you've tried to convince someone of something. So communication design 101. So what is it, right? Basically what it is pretty much the art of making a message heard, understood, and then remembered. The most important part actually is the remembered part, because a lot of people, we can sit and listen to something. We've all heard heaps of podcasts, TEDx shows, but how much of it do we actually retain? In the end, the things we actually do keep are the things that we feel inherently in ourselves, and we just, recreate it subconsciously. And that's when you know a message has been heard, when people start acting on it subconsciously, because it's kind of the message has seeped in. So to do this, we have to be very conscious about what we're doing when we're communicating. It's not a passive act. When you say design something, it's not designing pictures, it's not designing something pretty, it's actually trying to create something actively. So it's about not letting it be default, not letting it be passive, but being active about it. So when we mean communication design, what you're doing is you're taking a raw information dump, like words, concepts, all kinds of things, patterns you're seeing. You're taking that whole raw information dump, and then you break it down to conceptual chunks, and then you create hierarchy from those chunks so that it kind of makes sense in a particular order. Because human brains, even though we live in chaos, but we love order, because that's how we understand and learn things. So create a hierarchy from those chunks, and then after that is delivering your chunks in order timeline, because you can't just receive everything at once. Everything can only happen one at a time, no matter how much we wish multitasking was real. It's actually one thing at a time. So this is the basis of communication design. And as we go through this talk today, I'll be talking about how this basic concept actually applies to everything, right? Like strategy, brand, even negotiating, even when it comes to like process operations and people and culture. It kind of applies itself to any single moment you're working with another human being. Okay, so just to be more specific, so why does it matter, right? So we can't read minds. No one can read your mind. We can't read someone else's mind. Any of us who've worked with like someone who's given us a brief, we all experience the thing where they go like, why can't they read our mind? Why can't you know what I want? Mainly it's because you haven't done the work to actually communicate what you actually want to someone else. So this is the actual practice of learning how to be very conscious of how we get ideas moving from one person to the next. So when you do it well, right, you actually get a lot of things done. So you actually achieve two main things. You have business efficiency. So a lot of business efficiency and communication, it's about creating a shared logic through a very common narrative. And narrative is not like a story, right? It's basically your one line you can use to summarize everything you're doing, because no one's got time for 100 million meetings. So when you talk about strategy, it's actually about aligning multiple departments and teams with one guiding policy. So how do you align an entire organization of 100, of 200, 1,000 people to move in the same direction, right? Like Apple, for example, they just go think different. It's like, yeah. So what does Apple do? We just think different. Everyone from customer service all the way to your designer knows that our whole theme is to think different about how we do what we do. And then from there, you do the subsidiary, the coherent actions. So what does it mean to think different? It's things like, I will design things out of the norm and I'll make it as intuitive as possible. So coherent actions that you will take that reflect your guiding policy. So I'll go through all these in detail throughout this talk, but for now, this is roughly where it is. And then you have brand. So brand is another one that I'm very familiar with, because I led brand design for 2 years in Money Smart, and now 4 years with experience as well. So brand is one area that is not just a style guide. A good brand guide is actually having a very clear brand promise, because brand is not something just designers or writers do. It's everyone does it. Even when you're selling something, you're an account manager, the way you represent the brand, you have to know how to act. So aligning on a brand narrative, a brand promise is extremely important. And from there, you have brand principles on how everyone's guided on what to do within their specific functions. And then you have product. So product is an interesting one, because I'm relatively new to it, 2 years in, and I'm seeing the same patterns here as well. So in product, it's about knowledge sharing. There's always so much complexity in, when you build a product initiative, especially the big ones that include multiple features and multiple roadmaps that go on for 3 years. You have so much detailed knowledge. How do you condense all of it in a way that keeps the complexity but makes it clear? So balancing complexity and clarity becomes a pretty tricky one when it comes to products. And then you have process operations, another area where it's inherently very complex, but how do you organize it so that the complexity is clear and ordered as well? Because human brains love, order and action steps, basically. And then we have social cultural change. So we can think about it as fluff. We say like, be the change you want to be, say the things you want to mean, that kind of stuff, but actually trying to use communication to change how people act, how people behave, It's a lot around creating an environment for people to do the best that they do. So communication plays a huge part here, and it's actually a soft version of communication where you kind of nudge people more than you actually police them into behaving a particular way you want to, because, you know, we hate being told how to act and feel. So in this space, we got negotiation. How do you negotiate where, you know, when communication is everything, right? Because your conflict is conflict resolution, is moving mountains together, is trying to get people to believe in something they don't believe in, even down to even if it feels unethical, right? In some cases, all gray area stuff. So, you know, solving problems through empathetic partnership and reciprocity. So you're kind of building relationships through communication. And then you got people and culture. So people and culture is also an interesting one of balancing, like how much are you actually designing? How much are you actually taking from the ground up? How much are you doing in collaboration? So this is the area where communication gets a bit tricky, but you know you're good at it once, you know, everyone acts as though it was always this way and it's always been this easy and you're just a nice person. If all that's the reaction you're getting from people, if you do it well, that means you've communicated well in this space. So like all design rules, basically good design is very flashy and great design is actually invisible. So good design is like, you know, big shiny, make the big red CTA button stand out, that kind of stuff, like super flashy, but is it great because it's just super on the nose? Every time we see on the nose design, it feels tacky, it feels too obvious. We don't really appreciate it. But then when it's great design, things just felt easy, things just felt simple. Things felt like they were easy to understand. That's when great design is in action and you don't even see it. So great design is more felt rather than seen. And this is exactly where communication design sits. So what should we think about when we think about communication design? So it's a lot of shaping how you think, right? So the way, if you think in a particular way, you will act in a particular way, you will speak in a particular way. So you need to fix or adjust how your brain thinks about it first. So the first thing to think about when you think of communication design is it should aim for effortless understanding. It should be easy for them to understand, not easy for you to understand, easy for someone with no context, no understanding to understand. It's a lot of empathy there of trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes who doesn't understand what you're saying. So always show, don't tell, communicate as plainly as possible. Don't show off how much you know about the topic, because ultimately the person doesn't care. They're more concerned about how they're not understanding all your jargon. So always aim for effortless understanding. Be so simple that you don't have to like do mental gymnastics to figure it out. You should not be figuring it out. You should just be getting it. So that's effortless understanding. And then you should also aim for immediate impact. So we tend to do this thing of like when we want to explain something we believe in or we're trying to get a point across, we ramble. I ramble a lot. So which is why this is a big topic for me, because like I spent so much time trying to control it that I've made it into a way of how I lead my work and life and everything, right? So always aim for immediate impact because nobody got the time for anything and everyone's busy. And everyone's distracted, no one cares. So basically, always aim for immediate impact. Don't bury the lead. If you're going to say something, say it first and then expand on it later on, because expansion is just details. They just want to know what is the damn points and get to the point as soon as you can. When you're writing, especially when you're writing things, this is something to take note of. And then you've got like trust and credibility. So it's one thing to say a lot of fluff and say a lot of, you know, nice sounding things. It happens in brand a lot. So you can say like, yeah, we'll be the best in class UX or whatever. It's like, okay, but how? And how do you know that's going to work? So there's no trust unless you actually came back a message with data and evidence. And researchers, you guys would know this very well. So actions must follow your communications as well. So this applies especially to feedback. When you're asking for feedback, you want to have a dialogue. You can't just be like, okay, I'm going to listen to everything. Good, I understand. I feel your feels, and then do nothing. If you don't do nothing, people watch. So communication in this sense is people watch your actions later on, and your actions will communicate how you didn't listen to them. So when you think about communication, it's that full follow through. You have to follow through, not just the speaking part, but what you do after as well. And then when you think about communication design, you got emotional resonance. This is the most obvious one. So basically, in this sense, it's not just making them feel a particular roller coaster of feelings when you're presenting something, but it's also understanding what they're actually looking to get from whatever you're saying. I was thinking about this a lot when I was doing this piece. So the whole aim of this whole talk actually is for anyone who's within design, research, anywhere in your lives. You could be senior, you could be quite junior, who knows, right? But ultimately, it's a set of tools that you could use to actually figure out how to improve what you do. Or if it's terrible, you can reflect on it and actually go like, actually, that wasn't very good. I'll make my own version of communication design. But ultimately, it's something for you to interact with. So know your audience, and you should feel catered and understood as well when you speak to your audience. So then you have great communication design doing. So how do you do it? Basically, it's quite simple. You actually have to do context gathering. So when you're being, emotionally relatable and trying to understand what your audience wants, you have to understand what is it for, who is it for, when, where, how, all that. So always have this pre-work done, even if you're just presenting an idea to someone, presenting a new feature, giving some insights on something you've researched. Make sure you get a context before you even present what you're presenting. And after that, you've got the timing and orchestration. So you can't just do an information dump, right? You have to organize that information. So everyone learns and understands by building on top of something you give them or something they already knew. So think about where they're starting from, think about how you're building up the information as you're going along, and it'll feel a bit clearer and a bit easier for people to digest the communication that you're trying to give. And also consider how much time you have or need. So this is designed very differently, right? This presentation, if I was in a team, doing it with my team directly, it's pretty much, I'll just do this really short form, and then I'll be mentoring them for months. So I get a lot of time to spread out the communication on how to teach something. But if it's a one-shot talk like this, I'm just going to give you the basic tools that you can in little chunks to see what you want to do with it. So always think about what kind of opportunity you have for communicating in this case. And then you've got visual storytelling. This one, you see it everywhere, right? Add infographics, add pictures, make it look exciting, but don't get too excited. What I've learned from doing infographic design is pretty much don't add pretty pictures just for the sake of adding pretty pictures. People feel nice in the moment, but no one will remember it. Images and diagrams and any charts that you do should always support and enhance whatever content you're trying to communicate. So function should always come before form. If it simplifies your content, if it replaces your written content, do it. If it's just for the sake of making things look a bit less wordy, just be a bit careful and make sure it has direct meaning to what you're actually trying to communicate. And of course, you have to do preemptive preparation. So one thing I've definitely learned as having presented to other heads of departments and exco level people is you have to think about what they might ask next, because they always have questions in your mind as you're presenting something. So before you communicate anything, if you're trying to convince someone, you're trying to pitch something, always think of what concerns might they have as they're watching a presentation. If you're teaching someone something, think about what they might not be understanding at that point. Try to spot all the gaps you might have before you even do your communication, and try to fill in those gaps in the way you design the communication. Okay, so that was the intro, pretty much, like what is communication design? And this is pretty much how I would apply it in the way that I work right now. So basically all we'll be doing is taking big information dump, big chaos, big noise, and then creating order from that chaos into structured concepts that are ready for sharing. So ultimately, if you're doing communication design, you are a translator. So strategic narratives. The challenge on this one is it's easy to say I am doing strategy. I always personally felt like it always sounded like bullshit when I told people, what are you busy with? Oh, I'm doing strategy. You sound like you're bullshitting, because what the fuck does that mean? So that's why structure is important in strategic narratives, so that it actually leads to something doable, something actionable. So strategy documents always look like fluff. They look like kind of fun stuff, kind of interesting stuff, especially if you're a junior designer, you look at it and it's like, okay, so how does it matter to me? Like my bosses think that, and that's it. So they need to dig down even to the lowest, tiniest little atom in any business, right? Everyone has to be able to understand what it is. So in order to prevent a disconnect between people who are thinking and people who are executionally doing things. So it has to have structure. And then there is the other version where some strategies come across as just long checklists looking like strategies. It's like, we're going to do all these 100 things over the next year. That's a checklist. That's not really a strategy. It's kind of, okay, but what if I wanted to build on this direction that we're going into? Do you know how to build it? Or do I have to ask XX specific person on what they think about it before I can add it? If there is that lack of clarity in how you build on someone else's narrative, that means they haven't quite told you how their brain is thinking yet, and your strategy isn't clear. So if you have good communication there in terms of how you build a strategy, someone else can come in and go like say, for example, my strategy is building a financial platform that's really that will empower everyone to learn finances. And it makes it a bit easier for anyone to go, okay, I'll build some content. Okay, I'll build some other things, right, to add to it, and not just does it work in this system. And then, of course, you have multiple strategy documents that don't relate to each other. So every department makes their own strategy documents. They don't link to each other, and no one knows where the business is going. So that's also the other very common danger that happens when you don't have a very organized strategy, strategic narrative. So in that situation, everyone loses focus, and then efficiency and productivity declines. So what does a good strategy look like, right? There's a structure to it. It's not just stuff people think about. So in this next few sections, I'll kind of be breaking it up into two parts. So you have the green area, which is the narrative, like mostly the structure of when it comes to strategy, for example, how it usually, the chunks that you will need in it. And then noise is pretty much how to recognize noise. So when people talk about this stuff and they go like, yeah, I'm trying to input into this strategy, or I'm trying to, add a new strategy to this strategy, this is considered noise because they're all just specific talking points that people tend to have. So narrative is more like the high level chunks that you will build, and within which each of these tiny little points can fit into. So a narrative for designing strategy communications is pretty much you have a diagnosis. So it's like, what is the root cause challenge that your whole business or whole department is facing, right? So like, for example, our burger company struggles to sell on a crowded market. Like, okay, that's our main point. Not, no one had heard of us. This one seems like our competitors getting quite intense right now, but it's more like there is an overarching statement that you can actually use and everyone can think about and have more ideas about. And then you have the guiding policy. So you have the diagnosis, now you have the guiding policy. So what do we do about the problem? So one statement, pretty much a very short statement to outline your North Star approach to the challenge. So I will commit to eco-friendly practices, offer globally inspired flavors, that kind of thing. So what will we do without saying specifically what you're going to do? We're going to work with XX partner to do this thing. No, it has to be high level enough that anyone can add to it. So then you have coherent actions. So you have this one statement, we're going to do this stuff. Coherent actions, pretty much, you break it down into actionable groups of things you can do. So things like, we will source sustainably. So all these departments will work to figure out how we source sustainability. Diversify the menu, work with all these different departments to figure out what diversifying the menu means. So that kind of directs the whole team to kind of work on their own independent ways of laddering up to solving the problem. And then, of course, you got to measure it, right? So success metrics. So rather than seeing a list of metrics, which I always see, pretty much we're like, okay, we'll track CBR, CTR, churn rate, blah, 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 and cool. But then how does it all ladder up together? How does it all group together? So in a very similar way to when we do user testing, right? You get all these feedback, all this information, and then someone has to sit there, group all the ideas, put themes attached to them, and then represent it in a way that is easier for someone to understand. This is basically what we're doing here. So in terms of success metrics, you can do the same thing as well. So group the metrics into what they're actually for. So what does sales growth mean, right? Like, conversion rates and all these things. Brand recognition is a different set of metrics. So grouping things work in this case, and it makes it a lot easier for someone else to build on it. Okay, so what does great communication look like? So if you've done your chunking or how your strategy works, first of all, it has to be very easy to share, because a strategy in isolation is a dead strategy because no one's acting on it, no one's building on it. What is the point? So a strategy is meant for groups of people, not just one person. So it has to be physically, so like a written document or a one-page diagram or something, right? It's be easy to share, simple, small, you can share over WhatsApp. And it could be in the form of an elevator pitch, because sometimes you just need to explain to someone real quick what it is. If you can't, that means your strategy is not tight enough yet. You need to also condense everything you're doing into one line. And of course, structured one-page documents, so you can find all the chunks in one page, all the important points. Everything else is just detail or just a diagram, right? And of course, you need the consistent narrative. So each part of the strategy has to be connected. It has to relate to each other. So I can't be like, my actions they have to be related to the guiding policy. They can't be, something totally new. And it's like, oh, but we'll also be doing this. How is it connected? Or we don't look at it. If that's the case, that means you haven't, either your guiding policy doesn't capture everything, or your coherent actions are getting a bit too distracted, because then you have scope creep. Everyone starts adding on more things. So that's why people get distracted and we're less efficient. And of course, you need emotional connection. So it has to be relatable, and people have to believe in the strategy for it to actually work, right? If people believe in we're solving the right problem, we're doing the right things to solve the right problem, we're more likely to actually work on the strategy and actually develop something great. And of course, it has to be inviting. So it can't just be no one else gets to build on the strategy. It's just so and so owning everything, and that's it. That's a dictatorship. A strategy has to be built and pretty much cascaded down to every part of a business or your team. So that's strategy. Negotiating. So negotiating is something that I learned through freelance and from working in an in-house design team, because timelines are always one day long, and you always have arguments with the commercial marketing people all the time, because they're like, we want this by today, and you go, no, you can't have quality and speed at the same time. So how do we negotiate? Because very often negotiating turns into emotional discussions, which as a very emotional person, this actually means a lot to me. So how do we actually work out of it? So emotions and assumptions always create noise, right? So the noise in this case is all the extra stuff, the thinking and feeling and assuming. So how do we structure it so that it stops us from pulling emotions into the mix? Also, changing minds is difficult. You can't just change mind by throwing emotional things at people. Anyone who's tried to convince someone of a political discussion knows that you can't just throw feelings at someone. You have to have structured discussions and structured nudges in order to slowly help them change how they think. So negotiating kind of works that way as well, but on a smaller scale. So there is also a structure to how to have a very safe and clean negotiation. There are different parts to it. So together, you both need to figure out your purpose. So ultimately, you're both working to something together, right? So if you've got a good strategy, you both know what your purpose is. You both want to do the same thing, but then how you want to do it is going to be different. That's why you need to negotiate. So you need to align on your shared problem you're trying to solve. And then on your own, of course, so do all the pre-work before you get to the speaking part. So a lot of communication is pre-work before you even get to do the communication to another person. So the pre-work in this case is you need to figure out what you want first, what you want to trade off, what are your limits. If it's with your team, you all decide together. Build your case. So like simplify your ask. Don't ask for the moon. Figure out what do you think they will be accepting of? What would they be willing to give up potentially? So you're kind of preempting what they might be feeling and doing. And then also demonstrate scenarios. Like if I give up this much, here's the scenario. If I give up a lot more, then here's the scenario. So kind of work with how they might think in mind in this situation, but give them options. And of course, support your data with proven evidence. So it's not just your gut feel. And then once you actually get to the part where you get to talk to someone else, of course, you start with listening. So don't assume, don't just throw a stance at them and say, okay, take it or leave it, here we go. You have the other person has to feel like you're working together with them. So the best way to start that is listen to them first. So figuring out what their outcome is, what they want, what their concerns, and a lot of times people will actually tell you what they're actually looking for and what they might be willing to trade off. So this is a very valuable part of the discussion. And then you present your case. So when you present your case, of course, you have your case. So you go best scenario first. Always show the best thing first. Say why it's good, amazing and great, why it works for them especially, and not just you. Present other options, the less nicer options, and also what both sides will be trading off if you do them. But also, and also be extremely transparent about pros and cons, about what both sides will be giving up, and check with them if it's right. And ultimately, when you're having this negotiation, good or bad, ultimately you need to build the relationship, because you have to focus on your shared goals. You don't want to burn bridges. We all learned that when we're working. And also reciprocation is really important. So if they're being nice to you now and they're giving up something that they really wanted, but they're like, okay, cool, we'll just do this. Be sure to pay it forward and do it next time. So, or if you choose to give up something now because something else is coming up that you need to ask them for, do them a favor now to get your favor later. Transactional, yes, but it does work. Yes. So ignore all the emotional noise, because that will not help you get to your endpoint. Remember to think about order out of the chaos. So what does the great communication look like? Open communication. So over communicating is better than silo discussions. A lot of negotiations break down because people act behind they act behind their backs, or they don't know what someone else is doing. So people assume, panic, and then negotiations break down. So always communicate what you're doing because they can't see what you're doing, especially if you're remote. And then you have transparent processes. Both sides should be able to see exactly how both sides are working, so can actually understand where both sides are coming from. So always share your processes and keep it very visible to both. Also document what you're doing. So both sides, if you're doing this, making decisions, changes, timelines, all these kinds of things, share documents, share how we're changing things together, and always be inclusive. And of course, feedback and action. This is something I brought up earlier. Like if you want to adapt your plan together, hear feedback, you listen to them, they listen to you, but make sure it follows up with action. Otherwise, you'll erode trust really quickly because they're like, oh, you all just talked and you're just trying to make me feel better without doing anything about it. Then we have brand. So brand consistency. So brand is another one as well, because a lot of times when I work with new people, they kind of go, yeah, why can't we just have the style guide and some templates? That's it, right? Brand, all done. And it's not true, because brand it goes a lot deeper. When you have a team that produces everything, 100 different creatives every day, you don't have time to analyze every single creative and go like, that triangle is a bit too far to the left, please shift it. They have to know exactly where the triangle should be by gut feel. So brand is pretty much communicating gut feel and logic without being micromanaging. So everyone gets to be consistent and actually explore within the brand space while knowing the fences around it, like what is off-brand or what might be too far away. So this is a challenge from brand, because how do you make everyone freestyle while keeping them in the same theme? Okay, so in this case, it's a lot of stuff here, but basically it all led us back to your core narrative again, right? So your business mission and vision, what is it? What is the business for in the first place? And from there, you need to figure out what the brand promise is. Like, okay, if the business says we're going to do this, this is the market gap that we're feeling, our brand will present this way. So in the brand promise, like Apple, think different. So that's the promise. We always think different. And then you have brand principles. So pretty much these are the sets of like rules you have within, or well, rules or guidelines you have within the brand that everyone kind of agrees with. So share themes and logic to create consistency in how you think. So like, remember, how you think is how you act. So brand principles is that part of it. And brand language is pretty much like a language. You have all the different words you're going to use within the brand that represent it. So this is, as far as I would go, almost as a template in this case. So everyone knows what for example, in visual design, you have your elements, which is like colors, typography, motifs, storytelling rules. And then tone of voice, when it comes to copywriters, you have the brand personality, tone of style. So the atomic elements of the brand, basically. And then experience, you have, your UI, UX, and research principles. Like, how will we design in UI, UX, and research? Like, what principles are we following? And then, of course, it can expand to the rest of the whole organization as well. Even customer service could have like specific elements on how they do certain things, right? But all led up to the brand principles on how they will do something. And then you have the applications, which builds with elements. So from colors, typography, and motifs, you have logo, imagery, motion, so bigger chunks, your molecules, basically, tone of voice, and then you have your taglines, keywords, messaging, and so on and so forth, right? So, and templates are only used when you don't have enough time and need things to be done repeatedly and efficiently and lots of it. Templates are very handy. So these are always used, but they're pretty much your baseline. Everything else should be created. Okay, so this structure kind of helps to address to actually kind of manage some of the feedback you might get in teams, right? So sometimes you have some upper level person going, I think this blue feels more on brand for us. So like, okay, what does it mean? It's like, oh, I just like blue. It's like, so that's where you can argue from an angle of the brand promise. Like, okay, we're supposed to think differently, and blue doesn't represent different. And then principles mean, therefore, we only use bright, exciting colors because they aren't normally used. So that's how you argue from a point of narrative, rather than just saying, but our template says this, because usually that doesn't work when it comes to trying to convince someone why this thing feels off-brand. Okay, so in this space, it's important across the whole team to have consistent language. So if you keep saying like our brand is aspirational, everyone has to say like this triangles because aspiration. Red because aspiration. So we use similar language the whole time. So the more times the language is used, the more people are used to saying it. It's a practice. They become more fluent in it, and everyone's speaking with the same logic. And of course, you have to train brand advocates and guardians because you can't do it by yourself. So when you train a language, when you build a community of people speaking the same language, everyone will support it, and it's easier for the brand to actually feel consistent and actually stick. So in the way they make decisions, they are influenced by the brand logic. And of course, obsess on a narrative, not a template. So this is definitely one thing which is really important. So templates, like I said, right, they're kind of good for baseline, but they're not great for helping a brand evolve. And brands are living, breathing, evolving things. They will change as the business changes. If your brand doesn't change, it means your business is dead. It's not evolving. So it has to evolve, but not every day. It has to evolve over longer periods of time with purpose and reasons why you're evolving. So when you focus on a narrative, if you need to tweak the narrative, it changes the whole brand as a whole because everyone starts thinking differently and creating differently. If you change a template, it just means this one tiny molecule of a brand has been made different now, but it doesn't change inherently how you think of the brand. So if you want to drive consistency, you drive at the source, which is the narrative, and not the template. And with that, you can encourage exploration. So if you're not forcing templates all the time, people have space and headspace to be more creative and think about, okay, what does being different mean? And then they can actually explore within what being different mean with the same, maybe with the same colors, or if you want to add new color, what does different mean if we add this other color? So it kind of changes the way you think, but keeps it consistent. Product initiatives is another one. So this one, aligning cross-functional teams, so getting everyone to think and execute together. A lot of these teams are like repetitive because communication design is a pattern that exists everywhere, right? So in this space, it's balancing complex information for the right people at the right time. So this is a challenge that I tend to see a lot when working on product initiatives. So one thing I realized when you're doing product, like big product initiatives, not necessarily tiny ones, but tiny ones sometimes can help with some of this. Ultimately have a source of truth concept, basically. So to avoid excessive detail, because excessive detail always gets lost in the complexity of product. It's important to actually have a North Star blueprint set. So of course, you would need your stakeholder analysis. So know who's involved, who's the stakeholders, what they're going to be concerned about, what's the common language for everyone, what's the experience and skill profile look like. So this is why every working process for product is different because of this, because your stakeholders are always different, your teams are always different. Even if the same role, the skill set is different. So this is important to know before you even start anything, who's your team and who's involved. And then after that, of course, you have the initiative strategy. So this one's usually created either by CPO, head of product, someone who's quite senior, right? But of course, the rest of the team can input into this section as well. So in the same way that I talked about strategy earlier, the same steps: diagnosis, guiding policy, coherent action, success measurement. So everyone knows this in a very simple one-pager or a simple diagram, what is the skeleton of our entire initiative. It's not a PRD, it's a very high level version of it so that everyone knows what we're doing, if you have to like really quickly say it. And then the next part is the experience blueprint. So this is something I was doing in Money Smart, basically, because we have like large initiatives where we're building a whole loyalty platform, for example. You can't just be like, okay, it needs a store, it needs a wallet, it needs a tiny little avatar in the top right corner. There's a lot of little features you end up building, which makes it a lot to handle. So it's a lot easier if you break it down into chunks. So big information dump, chunk it up to make it easier to think about. So in this case, like everything that we can use to earn points, everything we can use to collect points and manage points, everything we can do to spend the points. So very simple, big experience chunks, and working out what kind of themes go into those chunks. And then only then you start thinking about designs. So this experience blueprint can either be spanning for a month or 3 years, right? So it depends. If it's a 3-year thing, then all the more your chunks have to be super high level because the world will change every month. So experience blueprint, super handy. And then you have your roadmap and timeline, of course. Like it doesn't need to be super specific, and it can just be a rough sense of what the team is expecting in the next months or so. So this part I find extremely important because It makes it a lot easier for stakeholders to make decisions on when to shift other initiatives and products. It also gives the team a bit more clarity and a bit more safety in knowing how to plan their time and to what kind of workload to expect. So this has to be done right at the start, a very rough, like within the next 3 months, we're working on this, and not just, oh, we'll just keep, the deadline is here and that's it. That's like, you can't just work to that. It has to be nicely chunked up so people know what to expect. And of course, in your kickoff, having all these first 4 points in there as well. And important part is actually speaking about the roles and responsibilities. So, RACI, all these things, like actually knowing who's responsible for what and who are the communication points, who's in charge of what communications when. So no one at any point should be wondering, oh no, who do I ask about this? Everyone should know who they should ask about this because no one's got time to think about that. So once all these paths and processes are super clear, it makes it a lot easier for people to move around in a very complex hub. And of course, again, use common language. So everyone speaks the same language, because if you have a very busy world, you don't want the language to be the one thing that confuses everyone. And of course, communication hierarchy. So this is the one where not everyone has to hear everything. Been in like a million meetings all the time, and most of my time is spent in meetings. I waste so much time, right? So how do we not do that? Because not all meetings are important for me or someone else. So for one, people tend to do that because they're resisting back channel discussions. So we put everyone in a meeting so everyone gets to hear the meeting. But because everyone's in it and it's so complex, no one remembers a damn thing. So you might as well not be in a meeting. So communication hierarchy, design how and where you do your communication and how detailed you're going to get for the audience that you're speaking to. So it's important to have channels for, broad discussions for everyone. The language has to be simple to match, and function specific discussions, we can be super detailed to actually get the context everyone needs. And always have templates when it's repeated communications. Like for design, we tend to do like brief coming in, the brief message looks like this, like the title is here, blah, blah, blah. Or like we're delivering something, deliverable title, all the stuff is here. So everyone can glance it and actually know immediately what it is. And of course, never assume. Always assume, never assume that everyone understands you or shares the same logic. So always know your audience before you even like present something in any product communications. Okay, process and operations. So this one, okay, we're getting to the end of it now. So it's similar to product in this case, but it's also more about how you manage complex communications in space, right? And of course, process and operations tend to involve many people, and the room for error, the margin for error tends to be quite small. Like you can't afford to make mistakes often. And sometimes if errors are made, it doesn't get noticed until way further down the line. So, which is why clarity and organization in this space is extremely important. So the rough anatomy is pretty much having your core process, again, chunking it up, and then having swim lanes, so right context for the right people. So everyone knows within their space what they have to do. So this takes away a lot of mental load of in the moment. Everyone knows what they're expected to do so they can actually not think about what they're supposed to do and actually do the thing. Okay, so just some general principles is transparency is really important. The wash flow should be super visible. You have to learn from your mistakes and document when mistakes are made so you don't make it again. It's a very document heavy kind of communication style in this space. Speaking the same language again, and action steps and checklists. So this is interesting for me because of having worked in marketing design versus product design. So marketing design, timelines are 1 day, 2 days long. Everything is super fast and rapidly changing, rapidly evolving. And versus product design, where you have a longer time frame to work in and you can actually do pretty clean process steps. So in this situation, right, creating action steps versus checklists. Action steps makes it easier and faster for someone to work, because if I have 1 hour, first 15 minutes I'm working on something, next 15, and then after, it takes away that mental load, and that tiny difference actually makes a huge change in how exhausting the day feels. So action steps, when you're kind of getting someone to work in a process, is a lot more effective in this case. Checklists are good if you just, the managing person, the project manager, is just looking over everything to make sure everything is done. But then checklists, if you're giving it to someone who's executing in a short timeline, can be extremely stressful because they think about it as one big chunk and not tiny chunks. So remember, big noise, small chunks. So always do it as far as you can. And of course, context is critical. So it should be clear what dependencies exist, how relevant, and everyone should be partners. There should be ownership with each other. If you need to change certain parts of the process, work on it together. And again, common narrative is what drives everyone, so that ultimately when you're doing everything, any changes or decisions that are being made to change the process should somehow reflect your business goals, your brand goals, or even your strategy goals. There must be some original narrative to take it away from a single person deciding something, because we don't want to make any process reliant on a single person. And then people and culture, this is the last one. So people and culture, this is it's a debate that I've been having with some people for a few years now. It's like, is it a top-down thing or is it a bottom-up culture? Because sometimes the culture just works. The culture is great. People join, they're like, oh my God, the culture is amazing. And then the top-down people come in and go, we need to design the culture, and they ruin it because they didn't connect bottom-up and top-down, right? So this is a very tricky space. And also, it has to be inviting enough that it creates grounds for growth. So when you kind of communicate with people in this space, how do you give them opportunities for growth without actively, forcing them down a path? So again, same thing, business mission, guiding narrative. Instead of principles and coherent actions, in this case, it's actually team culture values. So it could just be a few things, like 3 things that you all agree that you all do together. It doesn't have to be written down necessarily, as long as everyone knows what's important to the team and can actually say it really quick. Like, it's important that we're supportive. Psychological safety is important, that kind of thing, right? Good enough sometimes. As long as everyone agrees that those are the principles, and people who don't follow the principles or act negatively against them, you can actually adjust the behavior, because it's pretty much the principles that the whole team has agreed on together. Yeah. And then from your culture values, kind of how to grow within a team as well. So career pathways for each role, giving them specific levels and what's the expectation for each level. This also gives a bit more clarity as well in how you can grow, what you can do, what you're here for, like in their scheme of like the whole career, not just in where you work for. So this is pretty much how communication in teams kind of get set up. Also, culture should never be the default. It has to be designed in a way that is super invisible. So, which is where the invisible versus flashy is really important here. If culture is designed well, people feel like it's natural, or like it just so happens that teams like this. But if you design it well and they're saying that means it's actually been well designed. So in this situation, it's always important, lead by example. You can't say the culture is this, everyone be culture. It's the same as saying, I am very cool, I'm immediately not cool, right? So you can't just say stuff like that. So in the same way, so anyone who's a leader or, a strong voice in a team, for example, can do this as well. Like if you're a very strong voice in a team and people kind of, look to you, or they kind of mirror you a bit, always try and lead by example, do the culture, and then kind of reinforce with slight nudges in how you speak to the team, or how they speak to each other as well, or how you even empower others by giving them the space to try out being in the culture. So leaders in this space is important in how you create the right environment for the right culture to happen. So also recognize various expressions of the culture, because you don't want to be a police state. There is no correct way to express culture. There's no correct way to communicate. There is no correct way to act, because not all of us are right. We all have our own way of doing it. So it's important to recognize what your principles are and different expressions of those principles. And if you see the principle, the thought matters, the thought counts. If they're thinking with the right thoughts and they're acting in a way that still supports that, always support those actions. So this is what I mean by nudging and not just saying. Also dialogue, not dictatorship. So it only works if you have you can say that you can do a top-down culture, but then the bottom up has to kind of reflect back on it. If they didn't like something or feel like they're not being reflected on what they want as the team culture, you have to build it together and actually build something everyone is passionate about. And of course, being transparent is really important in this one, because transparency is how you give people some sense of development. Like, what does it look for them to grow? What skills are they missing? What do they need next, to reach the next level? Because as in my path as growing as my career, I've had situations where I was literally told like, oh, just keep working and then we'll see how next year. Oh, there's some stuff missing, but just think about it more. And I absolutely hated that. It felt like I wasn't supported. I felt like my boss didn't care about me. I felt like it was a dead-end job. So never do that if you want to make a growth team, in your team, a growth culture. So yeah, so transparency, laying it all out, being super transparent, adjusting it together also works, because then everyone's building the life they want in this case. So that's it. So in summary, everything I've talked about, a lot of the same pattern over and over again, but it's a big information dump and then make structured concepts from it. So think about this, and no matter what you do, and this is how you work on communication design. Any questions?
If you have any questions, you can now unmute yourself and ask it, or you can type it out in the chat box as well. And Harris, are there any questions in the live streaming?
No questions from the live streaming.
Okay.
Okay, then.
So those
right.
listening here, you can either post your question in the chat box. Yeah, someone has already.
Ooh.
Amanda says, hi, Sarah. Thank you for such an informative session. I'd like to ask, what are some roles that do more communications design within an organization?
So based on my experience, right? So I've never been a product person before, a tech person, so I can't speak for them exactly, but here's my sense. Designers do a lot of it because a lot of our job is communicating, whether in product or marketing, you do it because you need to communicate the brand, you need to communicate your ideas, you need to negotiate timelines, you need to negotiate your ideas against someone else's. So designers do it a lot, and not in just a design sense. Scrum masters, their job is just communication. Their whole job is about communication. Scrum masters, program managers, these do it a lot. Operations people, operation leads do it a lot because they have to make sure the machine's running fine. And how do they do that without micromanaging? Usually they have a very good communication framework in place. Product managers also do it a lot. The good ones at least. So good product managers, it feels very easy to work with them because there's a sense, communication design is good when you're speaking to someone and it feels like information is flowing very freely between both of you, and it's extremely productive. It's really bad if it constantly feels like you're being hit by a cloud of confusion or words, or you need to decipher what they're saying before you get to a point. So yeah, so I think communication design is kind of something everyone does as long as you're talking to another person. But in terms of actually part of their job, I would say design, product do it a lot, marketing does it a lot, strategy people do it a lot. Of course, research does it all the time. So yeah, in tech, I would say in tech, interestingly, tech leads do it a lot as well. It depends. It depends on what kind as well they do it with. But the best junior tech people or the more midweight tech people that I really like are those who communicate the most. And they usually have a very natural way of understanding what it means to communicate what they're doing, to translate very complex tech things to non-tech people. So those people rise really fast as well. Yeah, okay. Brand evolution.
I'll just read out what Amanda
Yeah.
has said for the benefit of those who are watching on our live streaming. So Amanda says that, thanks for answering the question, Sarah. Regarding brand evolution, is there an unhealthy rate of this where it is changing too quick? How does one judge where the communication design is healthy in its evolution?
So the sense when someone's being really wishy-washy versus someone who is making very measured decisions. It's the same with brand evolution. So if the brand keeps changing constantly, we're like, oh, this doesn't feel off brand, this feels off brand, or this is on brand, I like this, I like that, and let's change the brand again tomorrow. I've definitely experienced that before. And usually my main judging point of like, is this a good change, or is it like someone being wishy-washy? Is it rooted in some narrative that is a higher level narrative? So in this case, is it rooted in what your business vision is and therefore your brand promise? Do you even have a brand promise that the whole business is trying to express? The brand promise itself shouldn't change that much. It should change kind of slowly. So because it inherently changes what your business does. So for example, like Money Smart, right? For example, Money Smart's about like financial education, empowering people and making the right decisions. If my brand promise suddenly changes to something like I want to make insurance really fast for you. That's a total different business model already, right? So if that changes, the whole brand changes. And if someone's making a decision like, I think we should use green versus blue on a whim, and it's not tied to, does it express your financial decisions? Does it express your brand promise? And they can't articulate that. I will ask them that, like, how does it reflect the brand and the business goals? If they can't articulate that, then usually it's a whim decision. So yeah, so I would always use it as a kind of gauge. So especially if a brand is very new, sometimes that change happens really fast because you're still finding your feet. But of course, ultimately you need to actually test it with the market as well, right? So test the market, get your brand promise set. That part has to be well tested and worked out first, and then you do the other pieces of work for the actual visual brand, so that the first part holds as an anchor to everything else that comes after, and that kind of mitigates a bit of the change from that point on. But yeah,
There is
and
another. Okay, sorry.
no,
You
no,
can
sorry.
carry on.
If you want to
Th-
chat, by the way, you have my Telegram and WhatsApp, so we can keep chatting there if you want.
There is another question from Roy, and unfortunately, he has by mistake sent it as a direct message to me. So I'll just read it out for your benefit. So he says, first of all, he says that overall presentation and information structure was fantastic. So thanks to Sarah and team. And he has a question as well. How do you define and get approval for the communication design effort outside overall product design? Or is it integrated?
So in this case, I wouldn't say the way I do communication design is an initiative in a sense. It's usually named by something else. So if say I want to change a process because the process is very messy right now, I actually just keep calling it the process, but redesigning the process, rather than saying I'm going to do communication design here, because no one understands what that means. So I usually try to use the exact language that would mean something to whichever team I'm working with, to clean up some processes or renegotiate a cleaner way of working or getting ideas across. So if I'm saying let's communicate the strategy better, let's do the strategy better, I'm actually doing communication design and how I design the strategy, but using communication design principles. But I would actually say we need a solid strategy because we don't have a North Star, we don't have a narrative, we don't have diagnosis. So in this way, that's how I would convince people to actually adopt this kind of practice. This is what I mean by it's invisible, because you don't actually call it out. You don't actually say, this team all does communication design, because what does it mean? It's like trying to ask someone what does service design mean. I've heard many variations on what people say service design means, because it really depends in this case. I hope that helped answer your question, because yeah, it's more speak the same language as the person you're trying to do this to.
Okay, there is another question from Sabrina. And Sabrina says, one question, how do you see the role of emerging technologies such as AI and virtual reality shaping the future of communications design? That is, challenges, opportunities, how it can be incorporated in design process.
So fun fact, a lot of this presentation, I'm not going to say ChatGPT generated it because it didn't, but I worked with ChatGPT to think about it. So how AI works in this space, right? It kind of, because AI can just generate copy so easily, right? It can generate copy, it can generate images and stock images if I want to. It takes away the pressure from like the actual executional work and actually makes you question more why you're even doing it in the first place and what purpose it's for. And that's the space that narratives, guiding principles, and coherent actions sit, the high level stuff. So it's talking about like why you're doing this in the first place and for what purpose. If you can't define that, everything you execute beyond that point is useless, right? So I think AI only speeds up that focus into the why we're doing this section of how we work, more than just the doing part. So I think it's actually speeding up thinking through things. So the way I've used AI for this whole presentation, right, is a lot of, okay, so I have read a lot of books on like design, communication, UX, research, all kinds of things. But then at the same time, I have the library next to me, but I don't want to sit there referring to every single book all the time. So I go like, okay, from based on this book, the 5 principles, list them out and also cross-reference this one. It's like having a really smart intern sit with you at the library and just reference things for you. So it kind of helps think with you, so you can look at it and like repackage it into how you think it makes sense for the purpose you're going to use it for. So that's how I see AI supporting in this sense. It's helping me think through things and not focusing so much on the pure execution of things, because there are more important things to worry about. Because like if I just designed this whole presentation with just pretty stuff, but the structure was all off, this would be very useless, right? So even to this point, I'm still like, was it clear though? So I have more time to think about that. Is it clear enough? Does it make more sense? Because I don't have to worry so much about the nitty-gritty stuff. So that's for Sabrina's question. But also, actually, yeah. Yeah. I think the one thing to note about GPT though, like yes, it can execute stuff, but then we've had so many people do, so we have this thing called Baca Kucha in Money Smart, right? So basically people just spend one part of a day just talking about something cool they did or something cool they're interested in. Ever since GPT came about, all the presentations look exactly the same. The language is exactly the same and everything is generic as hell. So if you don't think about the purpose of what you're presenting, everything comes out as this generic stuff that no one really looks at, right? Or nothing's interesting because one, you're not thinking about your audience. Two, you're not thinking about how it relates to you. Three, you're not actually actively communicating to your audience. You're just letting a machine just say words, right? So that is the difference between communication design and just writing stuff. Okay.
So just want to check again, Harris, is there any question in the live streaming?
No questions for live streaming.
Yeah, there are no more questions here as well, and we are on time. So yeah, we can end the session for today, and we will meet for the next session again. Thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Yes, Sarah. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.